Welcome to Rauta's Worst to Best, this time a band from Sweden, Entombed. I don't know exactly what brought this to my mind when I was figuring out what kind of a band, which band I would pick for Worst to Best thing, but I guess this is a very fitting one to come to Rauta's this year because still in remembering LG Petro, rest in peace, who died a few months ago to various symptoms. The thing here is, Entombed is one of those bands that people talk about when mentioning classic Swedish death metal bands. And when we're talking about cornerstone black metal bands, Entombed is often mentioned like, yeah, they are the pioneers, they were the ones, paving the way and all that stuff. While it's, of course, true, I mean, they started with Nihilist and then quickly changed to Entombed and made a couple of classic albums known as, well, Left Hand Path, followed by Clandestine. They pretty much nailed it. Then, of course, other bands such as Dismember and, Grave, etc. came to be, but Entombed were there, as one of the early birds. One could say even they kind of ignited the whole thing, pretty much. Now, the funny thing is, even though people remember Entombed for their death metal classics, they spend most of their time in a very different genre, one could say. They pretty much also ignited, well, something called death and roll, at least the Swedish way. And that is something that Grave and Dismember never went into. And it seems like people are looking how much more they had impact on this other style versus the death metal that really gave their name and made the reputation and all. Now, people might also remember that Entombed guys got into some kind of a feud back in the days, and that's when LJ Petrov and a couple of other ex-Entombed members, well, went into different direction and had this band called Entombed A.D. While Entombed never seemed to continue with their music. I mean, it was Nick Andersson's band, pretty much. People keep saying that. And it seems, had legal rights to the name, and as such, Entombed A.D. was born to be. But Entombed never made an album after that. So it's as if these are two bands, but still basically continuing the same continuum, or at least did until LG Petro unfortunately died way too young and all. But this isn't about remembering him, that I already got through earlier 2021. This is more about going to the band's music and figuring out worst to best. Now, to be honest, I want to be totally honest with you. I actually did one version of the video already, but it was way too long. So I figured out, instead of doing that long, I'll talk a little bit about Entombed A.D. and make this a little bit shorter. Let's see if I actually can do that. So, no reason to go through the whole Metal Archives thing with the band. Started earlier in 1989 and then started progressing with Left Hand Path in 1990. But let's skip all the way to 2007. That's the last album Serpent Saints came out, and since that, well, there has been a few releases, but now albums at all. So one could say this time it seems Serpent Saints has been the swan song of the band known as Entombed, and nobody knows will it continue. I mean, Nick Andersson already has his rock and roll projects like Helicopters and also Lucifer, so I don't know what would be the reason to continue with Entombed's legacy with yet another death and roll kind of a thing. I think even the death and roll is too much to be said, because like most of the albums here are not exactly death metallic at all. They are rock and roll. And as such, for me, it was rather easy to figure out which would be my worst to best list for Entombed, because I can't say I like most of them. That's the honesty here, and I'll start with the worst. And that would be Same Difference from 1998. I mean, this is a kind of a pure rock and roll album, even though it features the kind of a growler, or rather grunting vocals. But the songwriting is sloppy, some of the riffs are actually horrible, and this feels very weak. Now, this is something that we could say is the kind of a 1990s symptom kind of a thing. I mean, there are lots of bands which wanted not only to go something different, but also change logo and all that stuff. And if you really think about this cover, having a different kind of logo, very unentombed like of a cover, and even the name, same difference, what the hell it's supposed to mean. It doesn't really sound entombed at all. I think this is a weak album. I would say this is Entombed Skull Lake in so many ways. Not only it's not the last album, and then the band kind of comes back, much like Celtic Frost did after Cold Lake, but it's also weak, it sounds different, and it's like a little bit like, let's forget it. It's quite of a bad album, and I won't recommend it to anybody. I wouldn't even say it's better than Cold Lake. It's roughly the same, well, level of quality. And as such, is the worst. Now, then comes like 4 albums, which in my opinion are pretty much the same quality, and their style is pretty much the same also. So I'm gonna just put it up all together and kind of get it over with it. And that would be the 1997 album To Ride, Shoot Straight and Speak the Truth, which was the first kind of a death and roll album. Well, considering that Wolverine Blues was more metallic. So maybe To Ride is more rock album than death and roll album in that sense. And Uprising kind of a gathered to pieces after Same Difference, kind of a catastrophe, followed by Morningstar, Inferno and Serpent Saints. But whereas Morningstar is a better album, definitely, Serpent Saints, Inferno, Uprising and The Ride are pretty much, in my opinion, the same continuation, same style, which is more rock, less metal. And none of them really stands out. They have here and there a little bit better ideas than Same Difference in overall. But for me, they were really lukewarm experiences. They don't, shine bright because of great production, because they don't have that one. LG Petrov's best days have been in the past, and the songwriting is pretty much like, yeah, let's do another album so we get the excuse to do tours. In my opinion, versus Entombed's original legacy, the first 2 or 3 albums, whether you want to include Wolverine Blues or not. I mean, these are more like putting them to shame. Like, why are you doing this? So it's a very different band altogether in style and all that stuff. And I can't say I liked any of them. I gave them a couple of spins because my early days with Entombed pretty much ended with Wolverine Blues. They started with that, and then I liked the early ones. And after Wolverine Blues, I kind of gave up. And for a good reason. And none of these albums, which I kind of revisited, if you will, made the difference. They are 6 out of 10 albums for me, and it's hard for me to recommend to anybody, except that if you want to experience the whole discography. So now that we have like 4 out of, or more like 6 albums, 5 or 6 albums already covered, it's pretty easy to figure out where this is going. Now, then I would say Morningstar is worth picking up, because actually that is more metallic, that is more death and roll, versus there are lots of other albums. This sounds heavier, this sounds more like the band is like, hey, we need to go back to more like what Wolverine Blues was going on. We need to have more metallic parts, we need to have heavier sound, we need to have a heavier album. And that's where this comes into play. And a lot of people say, yeah, you should include this one, even if you don't care for the rest of the Entombed albums. And I'd say it's true. This also has one of the best tracks of late Entombed, maybe the best track of late Entombed, called About to Die, which is kind of like, Slayer kind of a feeling right there. It's way more metallic and heavier and faster and all that stuff versus the late years of Entombed. And then we are already in top 3 of Entombed. Left Hand Bad, Clandestine Blaze, Clandestine, and Wolverine Blues. Which order would be the right one depends on very much on the people. But I know there are people who like Clandestine the best, and then there are people like me who would put it in the 3rd position, and that's where I'm going. Now, Clandestine featured another vocalist, and it's a little bit different than Left Hand Bad, but basically trying to, continue with this very same idea that what Entombed was doing already with the debut album. And while it's a totally enjoyable album, I don't have the kind of a super classic feeling getting out of it. The vocals are not that different, and actually they are good, but there's still something missing in my opinion. It's one of those albums you're kind of supposed to like, because it's a classic one, and it followed the already even more super classic debut album, but it still feels like it doesn't have the killer songs. So it was, for me anyway, kind of a hurried one. And that's where Wolverine Blues comes into play. Now, mind you, this is the one that is already kind of a death and raw album. But this got me into Entombed, and I really liked it because it's catchy, but it's heavy. It has Petrov's really strong, grunty, growly vocals, but also really catchy parts. Wolverine Blues, Out of Hands, Hollow Man, Eye Master, Full of Hell. You get the idea. So it's catchy, but really strong one. It has the rock and roll elements, but it's still very much tied to death metal, what kind of got Entombed going on. So that would be my second pick, and obviously now you know what is the best in my opinion as well. Well, Left Hand Path. Not only because it kind of paved the way for the whole Swedish death metal, but because it is very, very well done. The songs, you know, the old songwriting, the guitar riffs in general, the production, the vocals, everything is right there. Now, mind you, I have to mention that as much I have the ability to like bands such as Entombed, Dismember, Grave, and etc., I still am more into American kind of death metal. And maybe for that reason, I never fully clicked with Left Hand Path. Not so much like these 23 reviews on average having 99%. I get it. For a lot of people, this is the death metal masterpiece and could be very well the best death metal album out there ever. But for me, not so much. So this is pretty much the worst to best list. I would say skip everything after Wolverine Blues except maybe Morningstar. And to include these three albums, which I didn't originally plan to mention here because it's a different band, but then again makes no sense to include them in a separate video because it's only like three albums. Where does Entombed A.D. then again stand? I mean, it has 3 ex-Entombed members doing the kind of a death and roll. But the thing here is, this is very much like continuation to Morningstar, with all these three albums, Back to the Front 2014, followed by Dead Dawn 2016, and Bowels of Earth 2019. Now, I would say, especially Back to the Front, being the best of Entombed A.D., would definitely be right there on par with Morningstar, followed by Dead Dawn and Bowels of Earth later on. Now, all these three would be better, in my opinion, than most what Entombed did already, especially after Wolverine Blues. Well, maybe excluding that Morningstar one. So the kind of curious thing is, whereas Entombed went more into death and roll and kind of forgot that death metal part later on, Entombed A.D. brought back the death metal with rock and roll. And as a result, I would say, yes, Entombed A.D. has better albums than what most Entombed albums are all about. So it's kind of a curious thing, and unfortunately I think we are not going to see either of the band anymore because, well, Petrov is dead, unfortunately, and I fail to see how Nick Anderson would bring back Entombed anymore. Who knows, but that's the story. In case you still think Entombed as the death metal band, I think it's kind of a time to think again. There are other bands which did more death metal back in the days, even though Entombed was the pioneer and all that stuff. But be it as it may, this is my worst to best. I am curious to know about your worst to best and how do you think about Entombed A.D. versus Entombed. Let me hear your favorite albums by Entombed or Entombed A.D. or both bands, in case you feel like doing that. Thanks for checking out. Take care and see you soon with more worst to best videos coming your way.